Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. So before we start today's episode, we are about to hit 400,000 subscribers. We're going to be doing a Q&A, so ask me any question you like down in the comment section below. And also, if you really want to be noticed, send me a message on Facebook. We recently created a guide to help all you spacers out there protect yourselves from the various threats that can be found in outer space. Whether it's a pod of Purgle or a flock of Minox, you now know how to identify, engage, and destroy them with extreme prejudice. Today I want to extend our training to another element of being a spacer that most of you unfortunately will have to face, and that's space combat, mainly focusing on smaller craft. On Earth, we call it dogfighting. In any type of activity, natural skill and ability will only get you so far. When it comes to an activity that routinely involves death and injury, those who do not prepare are not only stupid, but they're also usually the first ones to die. In the Imperial Academy, one spends months identifying the silhouettes and shapes of each Imperial rebel and many of the popular civilian models of starfighters, freighters, and larger ships. With that knowledge, pilots can quickly identify enemy ships and begin to figure out what their loadouts potentially could be. Is it a single pilot ship? What kind of weapon does it have? Laser cannons? If so, how many laser cannons, and what is the firing rate, and what is the power, and what is the range of these laser cannons? Are we talking about a T-65B X-Wing with its 4 wingtip mounted KX-9 laser cannons? Rebel pilots like calibrating the convergence points for all 4 of these cannons, usually at a range of 1,000 and 1,500 meters. It's good to know this range because that's where the X-Wing pilot will be able to get most of its shots on target. Or is it something heavier like the massive cannons on the ARC 170? In that case, make sure your gun defense is constant, or else one of those bolts can easily strip your shield and penetrate your cockpit. Or is that just an Imperial eyeball following you? TIE fighters are short-range defensive interceptors, not all that dangerous at long range, but add another wing to a TIE fighter, then all of a sudden it's a TIE defender and you're dealing with concussion missiles or, God forbid, proton torpedoes if that pilot really wants to kill you. Concussion missiles at range are usually pretty easy to deal with, just fire off some flares. Proton torpedoes are usually used for capital ships and larger targets, and even if your defensive measures set them off, the blast still might catch you and disable your ship. But say you've identified a vulture droid, then most likely what you'll be facing will be buzz droid canisters. In that case, the best tactic is to allow the canister to overshoot you, and then quickly break away before the droids can latch onto your ship. Sometimes you'll spot the enemy first, and you'll be given a second to think and plan an attack. Knowing what your enemy is flying and what it's capable of will give you a huge advantage. Starship designs vary greatly, far more than aircraft designs that all have to create lift in a similar way. A TIE fighter has a forward-facing cockpit and 2 giant blind spots on either side due to its large solar panels. They're relatively easy to jump from almost any direction. A BLT-B Y-wing might seem slow and vulnerable, but be careful. They also come with a rear gunner. A rookie pilot might make the mistake of flying right into that gunner's field of fire, while a more experienced hunter will come from the rear and below where the pilot and the rear gunner can't see them. But that's only the BLT-B Y-wing. The BLT-A4 Y-wing used by the Rebellion was more of an assault fighter bomber, and had its rear turret removed to decrease weight. In my opinion, not enough weight. They can easily be identified by their exposed engines, lack of paint, and shorter life thanks to the removal of fairings on the engine. They can easily be shot down from behind. Now that you've identified the enemy fighter and what kind of weapons it's carrying, you also have to figure out what its flight characteristics are like. In the old days, that meant jumping into an actual fighter and testing it out, something that most pilots don't really have the luxury to do. But now, thanks to state-of-the-art flight simulators, you can replicate the characteristics of almost any starfighter. Most battles take place in space, and starfighters are equipped with G-force nullifying inertial compensators, so things like gravity, air resistance, and structural integrity don't really matter nearly as much as they do with traditional fixed-wing aircraft. But things like turning radius, thrust, and acceleration are still quite important. Most pilots will be quite familiar with the flight characteristics of their own vehicle, but being able to compare your vehicle to the enemy's vehicle's flight characteristics is equally as important. Say you have an RZ-1 A-Wing pursuing your tie-in space superiority fighter. If you're familiar with the handling of an A-Wing, you'll know that there's no hope in outrunning this ridiculously fast interceptor. You'll also know that the A-Wing is notoriously hard to control with its sensitive inputs. Its incredible thrust to weight ratio makes doing anything other than flying in a straight line a pretty difficult maneuver. The best way to defend yourself is to break and perform a maneuver that will force the A-Wing to overshoot you. Use the TIE Fighter's smaller turning radius, and then the defender becomes the attacker. Then you have strange aircraft like the B-Wing, which have a cockpit and body that move independently from each other. This is an extremely confusing sight for a rookie pilot, but an experienced fighter will know to avoid the body of the starfighter and focus just on the cockpit because it remains in the center of thrust at all times. B-Wings are also assault fighter bombers, so they don't maneuver that well and only fly really well in a straight line. This means as an attacker, you can focus more on your gunnery than having to prepare for some quick rapid movement. So you've spent thousands of hours looking through various flight manuals, maybe identification kits or field guides. You've sat in a variety of simulators. Maybe you've even piloted some interesting uglies like the Y-TIE. This is all great and you've given yourself a big advantage, but honestly, if you don't follow this next step, it won't really matter. Erich Hartmann, a German World War II ace, credited with 350 kills, mostly on the Eastern Front, used a simple strategy he called See, Decide, Attack, Reverse, which allowed him not only to claim a record amount of kills, but also survive the entire war. Although flying in vacuum is very different from flying in atmosphere, Erich Hartmann's method can still be used in space battles. The first part of the strategy is one of the most important parts, and that's to see the enemy first. Most air engagements are won by the attacker or the one who sees the other fighter first. This means always scanning your environment and using your sensors, and if possible, flying under cover. Now, of course, that isn't always possible, especially if you're escorting other ships or flying in larger formations. But be aware of your surroundings constantly. Don't take any breaks. That asteroid field on your flank or cloud of gas might be a great hiding place for you to ambush the enemy, or it might be a great place for them to ambush you. Now, if you're able to see the enemy first, now you can make a decision to attack or not. Hartmann almost never attacked unless he felt like he was in an advantageous position. If he felt like he was outmatched or the enemy had spotted him, he would usually use his Bf-109's powerful engines to escape the enemy fighter before they even come into range. However, if he did decide that he was undetected and in a good position to attack, Hartmann always approached the enemy from its blind spot, usually from behind and above. Now, in atmosphere, a dive gives the pilot some advantage in speed because of gravity. Also, if there's a sun high in the sky, it might potentially blind the enemy from his approach. In space, the positions are more equally balanced. There is no true above or below. Everything is relative to your enemy's position from you. And as we talked about before, every ship has its own blind spot that can be exploited. Another part of Hartmann's approach was closing the gap between him and his enemy until he was under 100 meters away, and then opening fire. This was important because he never opened fire until he was at a range where he was sure that he could not miss. This also meant that he would never give up his position early and let his enemy react. The Bf-109 was also armed with heavy cannons, which could do a lot of damage, but also had a slower firing rate. This made getting shots on target a bit hard, but when they went on target, they usually destroyed the enemy very quickly. Oftentimes, Hartmann's enemies never even saw him coming. This works equally well in space. Rookie pilots will oftentimes start firing random shots when they're miles out of range, easily giving up their position. Unlike cannon shells, which will occasionally have tracers in them, every laser bolt is basically a tracer. So getting up and close and personal is a great way to secure that hard-won victory. Now, after Hartmann shot down an enemy fighter, he was never greedy and quickly disengaged to a position where he was safe and where he can reassess the situation and then restart his entire tactics all over again. This is oftentimes where a lot of younger pilots will get into trouble, especially during a heavy dogfight that involves dozens of starfighters. After getting their initial kill, they'll continue pursuing other fighters without a complete awareness of their surroundings, at which point things devolve into a messy game of luck rather than skill. Now, occasionally you guys will be flying in squadrons with wingmen. Practicing formations and maneuvers and tactics are incredibly important for success, and there really is no substitute to constant drilling. While most fighter squadrons should be made up of the same aircraft, sometimes pirates or even the Rebel Alliance will have squadrons full of mixed aircraft. In this case, it's very important to note the different flight characteristics of each fighter in a squadron. For instance, an X-Wing can generally draw more fire and take more punishment than a much faster A-Wing. So let's say you're trying to sandwich an enemy fighter. It might be a better idea to have your X-Wing draw the enemy's attention while the A-Wing performs a flanking maneuver. When spacing is important when flying with a wingman, it's also equally as important to keep an eye on each other. The TIE fighter pilots of the 204th Imperial Fighter Wing were ruthless and purposely tried to isolate rebel fighters from the rest of the squadron and destroy them. They usually use this tactic right before a rebel fleet was trying to jump and escape from them. What they would do is pick off one of the rebel fighters and prevent them from jumping into hyperspace. The Imperial pilots can then destroy that fighter and then search through its nav computer and potentially even find the jump coordinates where the rebel fleet has escaped to. Now, to leave you off, I'm going to give you guys two important quotes. One is from Francesco Baracca, an Italian World War I ace, who said, "To the aircraft I aim, not the man. There can be no hesitation in a dogfight. One must enter the arena and be ready to kill, because the stakes are incredibly high in these combat situations and there is very little room for error." Aim at the aircraft and not the man also talks about the mercy you should give an individual should they eject out of their fighter and go EVA. At this point, they are separated from their killing machine and no longer a threat, but just a fellow pilot. The second quote is from Eric Hartman: "Fly with your head, not your muscles." There is no room for emotions, and there is no room for underestimating your enemy. In the opening days of the war, Eric Hartman fought against Soviet pilots. These pilots at the time were poorly trained, and their planes even lacked proper gun sights. On his first mission, Hartman eagerly dived against an enemy squadron against the orders of his commander and almost killed himself. He had underestimated his enemy's abilities, and he also overestimated his own abilities. So a good rule is to never be eager to kill, be eager to survive. And also, don't be eager to be a hero, be eager to be smart and practical. Well guys, I hope this guide will help you guys survive your future dogfights and combat engagements. Let me know if I'm missing anything or if you have any tips that you like to use against enemy fighters in the comment section down below. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.